Let's get one thing out of the way. The Napoleonic Wars were brutal. From 1803 to 1815, Europe was torn apart by battles so chaotic and deadly that it rewrote the map of the continent. Millions died, cities were leveled, armies marched thousands of miles through mud, snow, and blood. But while history books often talk about generals and empires, they usually skip over the kid who was right in the middle of it all, wearing a too-big uniform, holding a pair of drumsticks. That kid was the drummer boy, and his life sucked. The title might sound harmless, maybe even heroic. Drummer boys are often shown as symbols of bravery, pacing along the marching troops, beating time with fearless rhythm. But strip away the glory, and what you've got is a terrified child thrown into one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, with nothing to protect him but a drum. Let's talk about why being a Napoleonic drummer boy was one of the worst jobs a kid could ever have. First off, the age. We're not talking about grown men or even teenagers. Many drummer boys were as young as 9 or 10 years old. In fact, some were even younger, especially if their fathers were soldiers. Sometimes they were orphans taken in by the regiment. Other times, desperate parents would volunteer their sons in exchange for food, money, or protection. There was no real training, no manual, no preparation for the horrors of war. These boys were just handed a drum and told, "Keep the beat." Sounds innocent enough, until you realize that beat was the lifeline of the battlefield.
You see, in Napoleonic warfare, communication was a nightmare. There were no radios, no walkie-talkies, not even signal flags that could be reliably seen through cannon smoke and musket fire. The only way to coordinate thousands of soldiers was through sound. And that's where the drummer came in. The drummer's beats told soldiers when to march, when to halt, when to attack, when to form a square against cavalry, and even when to retreat. The rhythm had to be clear, constant, and correct. A wrong beat could mean an entire battalion walking straight into enemy fire, or failing to react when a cavalry charge thundered toward them.
So, imagine you're 11 years old. You're in the middle of a deafening, screaming, exploding battlefield. Smoke chokes the air. The man next to you just had his head blown off, but you can't stop. You can't run. You can't cry. You have to drum. And if you mess up, people die. That's the job. Now let's talk about where the drummers stood. Surely you're thinking, they must have kept the drummer boys far from danger. Maybe toward the back, maybe with the horses? Nope. Drummer boys marched in front of or beside the troops. That meant they were exposed to musket fire, cannonballs, and sword-wielding cavalry, just like everyone else. In fact, some enemy soldiers would target drummer boys on purpose. Because if you killed the drummer, you disrupted communication. The army wouldn't know when to attack, fall back, or regroup. So drummer boys became high-value targets. Little boys, first in line to die. And they weren't allowed to carry weapons.
You read that right. They were not armed. Most carried only a drum and maybe a small knife. But knives don't do much against bullets or sabers. If you were caught out in the open, or if the line collapsed, you were defenseless. The enemy wouldn't always show mercy either. Drummer boys were seen as part of the army, and often killed just like soldiers. So picture this. You're 10, holding a drum, watching grown men scream in agony. Horses trample the wounded, and enemy soldiers come charging at you. You can't hide. You can't fight. You can't even run without being branded a deserter. What's worse, some of these boys were punished like adults. If a drummer boy was caught crying, disobeying, or running, he could be beaten, whipped, or even executed, just like a full-grown soldier. The military didn't care about your age. You wore the uniform, you played the drum, you were a soldier. There are stories of young boys court-martialed and flogged in front of their units to set an example. Discipline didn't make exceptions. And don't think things got better after the battle. When the fighting stopped, drummer boys didn't return to comfortable beds or warm meals. They slept on the ground, in rain, mud, snow. They ate what the soldiers ate, often stale bread, rotten meat, or nothing at all. Disease was rampant. Hygiene didn't exist. Many kids died from sickness rather than bullets. There are even records of drummer boys marching hundreds of miles, their feet wrapped in rags because their boots had long since fallen apart. Frostbite, dysentery, lice, and exhaustion were constant companions. And yet, they had to be ready the next morning, drum in hand, ready to march again. Let's not forget the psychological toll. Modern soldiers with years of training, gear, and therapy still suffer from PTSD. Now, think about a child, his mind still developing, being exposed to death, chaos, and horror every single day. Many drummer boys lost their innocence completely. They watched their friends die. They watched their own limbs get blown off. They saw things that would break any adult. Some went numb, others broke completely. But the war didn't stop for them. They were expected to keep going, keep drumming. And if somehow, by pure luck, a drummer boy survived the war, what was waiting back home? Usually nothing. No pension, no medals, no hero's welcome. Most returned poor, traumatized, and forgotten. There was no schooling to return to, no support, just the memory of death and the sound of drums in their heads.
A few lucky ones were adopted by officers or remembered in stories. Some became drummers for ceremonial roles. But most disappeared, swallowed by history, buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten. And if all that isn't tragic enough, let's talk about the propaganda. Governments loved using drummer boys as symbols of courage and patriotism. They appeared in posters, paintings, and poems, smiling kids in clean uniforms bravely leading the charge. But that image was a lie. The reality was much darker. A disposable child soldier used to stir emotion and distract from the horror of war. In fact, some paintings from the Napoleonic era show drummer boys dying heroically in battle, as if that was something to be proud of. Imagine the twisted logic there. You send a child into hell, watch him die, and then paint a pretty picture to call it noble. It's heartbreaking. One of the most famous stories is that of Joseph Barra, a 14-year-old French Republican drummer boy during the Revolution, just before Napoleon's rise. He was reportedly ambushed and killed by royalists and became a national martyr. Napoleon himself used his image for propaganda, but even that tale is debated. Some historians say the story was exaggerated or even invented. It didn't matter. What mattered was having a symbol, a dead kid who could inspire more kids to join the fight. Because that's the final awful truth. Drummer boys were never just drummers. They were tools of war, tools of control, and tools of emotion. They were a way to give war a human face. A child's face. And once they'd served their purpose, once their drum fell silent, they were discarded like everyone else. That's why it sucked to be a Napoleonic drummer boy. Not just because of the danger, not just because of the fear, or the pain, or the loneliness, but because nobody cared. They were used, chewed up by the gears of empire and forgotten. And today they barely get a footnote in history books. No Hollywood films, no monuments, just fading memories and a few scraps of uniform buried in the soil of Europe. But they were there, keeping the beat, even as the world around them fell apart.